me, my name is Lauren Bowen, and I work here as the provost, the senior academic officer. And one of the best parts, favorite parts of my job is having the opportunity to bring the community together, to hear from speakers, leaders, to build that kind of intellectual community where we can have an exchange of ideas as students, as faculty, as staff, as community members. And so it's a real joy and a privilege for me to introduce this evening's speaker to you. And in thinking how I wanted to frame that and what I wanted to say, I was reflecting on a book I read a couple years ago. I think it was 2019, which matters because a lot has happened in the last 3 years. And the title of the book was Leadership in Turbulent Times, written by an historian, Doris Kearns Goodwin. And in that book, Goodwin profiles folks that we traditionally think of leaders, people who were in positions of leadership, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, and talked about what it meant to lead during tumult. And so she offers a couple of observations, and I know I'm echoing. Am I okay? So, all right. She offers a couple of observations that I thought might help contextualize tonight's talk. Scholars who have studied the development of leaders have situated resilience, or the ability to sustain ambition in the face of frustration, at the heart of potential leadership growth. More important than what happens to them is how they respond to reversals, how they manage in various ways to put themselves back together, how watershed experience at first impeded, but then deepened, and finally and decisively molded their leadership. That spoke to me. And she says this as well, if you're thinking about how to lead. This will speak to those of us who teach as well. Avoid dull facts. Create memorable images. Translate every issue into people's lives. Use simple, everyday language. Never use big words when small ones will do. I'm pleased tonight to be able to introduce our speaker to you as someone I know who is helping to lead through turbulent times and who models the kinds of attributes that Goodwin describes in terms of resilience and in terms of humanizing leadership. Marcy Levy-Shankman serves as the Chief Organizational Learning Officer for the Cleveland Municipal Schools. To have that kind of opportunity in the midst of a pandemic, coupled with a profound social justice movement that demands we reckon with our racialized past, is quite an opportunity, isn't it? And it requires, I think, the skills and the habits that Goodwin describes, as it also suggests an attention to others in a thoughtful and purposeful way. So in the foreword to this book, authored by tonight's speaker, Susan Comevi says, leadership is a relational and ethical process of people together attempting to accomplish positive change. Leadership then is all about relationships and thriving together to maintain healthy and effective relationships, which requires emotional intelligence. And so our speaker tonight, Marcy Shankman, I think models this, and she has something to contribute to our conversation about emotional intelligence, about effective leadership, as she is both a practitioner and a scholar. In addition to serving as the Chief Learning Officer for the Cleveland Municipal School District in Ohio, she's the author of Emotionally Intelligent Leadership, a Guide for Students. She earned her PhD at the University of Indiana, her master's in college student personnel from Maryland, and her Bachelor of Arts from the College of William & Mary in Religion and Anthropology. She has over 20 years experience in leadership development and organizational effectiveness. She's the former Vice President of Strategy and the Director of Leadership Cleveland. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Marcy Shankman, to Juniata, who will talk to us and engage us in conversation about navigating through turbulent times with emotionally intelligent leadership.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. How are you? Wait, what? Oh, really? That's it? Good. All right. How are you this evening? All right, that's much better. Is it okay if I take my mask off? Okay, fabulous. It is lovely to be here with you, and thank you, Lauren, for that lovely introduction. I'm daunted that I'm in the same sentence with Doris Kearns Goodwin. That is a really humbling place to be. If that is a name that you're unfamiliar with, she is an incredible historian and author and investigator of truth and understanding not just about leadership, but about life and about what's happened in our country. So thank you for putting me in such great company. I am so happy to be with you tonight. As I was driving in from Cleveland, Ohio, I was thinking two things. Well, I was thinking a lot. It was 4 hours. So there were lots of thoughts going on. One thought was, who would have thought that February 10th, I could drive from Cleveland to Juniata in Huntington, Pennsylvania, and not see one flake of snow? Amazing, because while you may not know, Cleveland received 30 inches of snow in the last 2.5 weeks. So Lauren and I were going back and forth. Is the weather going to hold out? Thank you, Mother Nature, for holding out so that I could have an easy drive here. The other thing I was thinking was, what a joy for me to be with you, because I really miss the college campus. So my background is actually in working in higher education, but I made a very deliberate choice many years ago to try and spend more time in this leadership development space. And what I want to share with you tonight is the accumulation of a lot of years of looking into what is this thing we call emotional intelligence in the context of leadership, and why does it matter? And so I'm going to take us on a little bit of a journey, and I'm going to ask you to take part in this conversation, because one of the things that I confirmed when I was asked to be here with you tonight was that I could actually engage you in dialogue and have you engage in dialogue with each other, because I really don't like to be a keynote speaker. Now, I have lots of ideas to share. I have some stories to tell. I hope I get to provoke some thinking, and I hope you get to think with each other about what does it mean to navigate through turbulent times with emotionally intelligent leadership. So we're going to go on this little journey together. And I'm curious, what do you see in this picture? Just throw it out. What do you observe in this photo? People. Oh, wait. Yes, there are people. Does this work? Oh, yeah, look. They're walkers, hikers. All right. So there are people. A creek.
Whitewater rapids.
Rapids. Whitewater rapids.
Trees.
There's a... Yeah? Yeah? Lots of water. Some rocks. Torrents? Oh, torrents. Yeah. You can see the movement of the water. What are some feelings that come up as you look at this picture? Excitement.
Peaceful.
Peaceful. Relax.
Warm weather.
Warm weather. Yeah, what a concept. A little bit of nervousness. So lots of different emotions, lots of different ways to take this picture in. I want you to keep this in mind as we talk this evening, because I rely a lot on nature, both personally and professionally, for my grounding and for gaining perspective. And one of the things you've just observed is there are some contradictory things going on in this picture. There's stability with the trees and solid ground that you see, and there's movement. You see danger and you feel peace. You've got some contradictory emotions, you've got some contradictory actions or realities. And this is the world that we live in. And we're going to come back to this picture and this notion that we're on a journey. So I hope you'll join me. So get ready for the ride. This is actually me with my family on a whitewater rapid trip. My kids are in that picture, my nieces and nephews, their cousins are in that picture. And I want you to imagine that you are in a raft. How many of you have been whitewater rafting? How many of you are scared at the thought of whitewater rafting? Yeah, me too. I was terrified. How many of you would never go whitewater rafting if you were given a chance? Absolutely. Good. How many of you would go the minute you were given a chance? Okay, good. So we have some adventurers in the crowd, and we have some folks who are like, no, thank you. You just go ahead and do that. For tonight, imagine that we're all in this ride together. And I want you to think about, how do we be prepared for a journey? And this has everything to do with how do we navigate turbulent times, because we've got to carry some equipment with us. We have to carry some tools and things that we can use. So if we were going whitewater rafting, what might we carry with us in our backpacks? Literally or figuratively. What kind of equipment do we need?
Water.
Well, yeah, you want to have water that you can drink, because you're going to be on the water, but you also want to drink some water.
A paddle.
A paddle! Yeah, so imagine there's a paddle in there. What else might be in our backpack if we're going on a whitewater rafting trip, or even if we're just going on a hike, like those people in that picture? What else might we have in there? Food. Yeah, we need some fuel. We've got water, we've got food. We might need some sunscreen for protection. We might need a hat. We might need a jacket.
If you're going to hike, you have to need a pair of nice shoes.
Yes, you have to have good hiking boots, good shoes. You might have a map. So what I want you to think about is kind of this backpack as a metaphor for what do we need to navigate turbulent times from a leadership perspective. Well, we have some things naturally in our backpack. We have assumptions and we have perceptions because we are human beings. That's how we exist in the world. We also have these things called assets. We have some strengths. We have some tools. It's like we have the paddle and we have the map and we have the food to give us energy. And the other thing we have in our leadership backpack are choices. And we're going to go through what do I mean by assumptions, perceptions, assets, and choices as we think about navigating through turbulent times. And I'll give you a hint. Emotionally intelligent leadership is in our backpack, very naturally. So let's talk about some assumptions because I want to qualify or share some stories with you about how does this actually play out. Lauren said I work at the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. It's also called the Cleveland Municipal School District. Don't ask me why, it'll take us way off course. What are some assumptions you have about an urban public school district? What kind of assumptions would you make about an urban public school district? Yes?
That it's going to be rough.
That it's going to be rough. Describe rough.
So, like, you're going to have behavior issues, you're going to maybe more likely to have, like, drugs or weapons or something like that.
Okay, that's the urban part, right? You've got the ills of the city baked into the school system. So it's going to be rough. That can affect students, that can affect faculty, that can affect the school building, the community. What other assumptions do you have?
Less funding.
Less funding, absolutely. We may not have as much money because it's a city. By the way, Cleveland is the second poorest city in the United States. That's not an assumption, that's a fact. Yes?
Crowded.
It's crowded. Yeah. Maybe we don't have enough space for everyone.
A majority minority school district.
Tell us what a majority minority school district means.
Most of the learners are not white. More than equally diverse.
Okay, so a majority minority school system means that most of the learners, the students, are not white. Okay, so what's the truth of the Cleveland Metropolitan School District? None of you said it was big, which I'm sort of surprised by, but we've got 37,000 students. We have 100 schools. Sorry, we have not quite 100 school buildings, but we have 100 schools that provide space for 37,000 students. So actually, it's not crowded. We actually have a lot of space in our schools, so we can break through that assumption. We don't have a lot of money. We're spending $11,000 per student. Is that much? It's really low. So we're not spending much. So you're right, not great funding. And we do have a majority-minority school system. Anyone want to guess what the demographics of the teachers are? Is that, do we have a teaching staff that is majority-minority? What's your assumption? No, correct. We do not. It's flipped. So we're mostly white teachers in a school district that is mostly non-white students. Now, none of you talked about how good the system is. Talked about safety. We do have some safety issues, but actually not as many as you would think. But none of you talked about the quality. And that might be because you're being kind, and you're not sure if you can go there. But most people assume an urban public school system isn't very good. the quality of the education isn't very good. What we have is some really great data that shows we're making progress and we're improving. So we have a national study, this NAEP study that says adjusting for poverty, we've outperformed schools throughout the state in national scores in 4th grade reading. That's really important because if you can read, then you can learn. So the first few years of school, you learn to read, and the rest you read to learn. So if we can get our kids to learn by 3rd grade, there's tremendous demonstration that they make it to college. We're actually making huge progress there. And that ultimate measure of do we graduate our kids, I don't know if you can see back there, but in 2010 and 11, our graduation rate was just over 50%. 10 years later, it's at 80%, almost 81%. That's a huge improvement. So I want you to have that sense of, that's the organization I work for, because we're going to talk about how did CMSD, that's what we call our district, manage through this turbulent time, which you can imagine we've all just lived through and are still living through. So what I want to talk about then is what was the leadership component here to this story. And we have some basic assumptions about what is true about emotionally intelligent leadership. So fundamentally, leadership is both art and science. There are certain things we can say from research that we know to be true about leadership, and there's no such thing as, in leadership you must do blank, because there's this art form to effective leadership. So some of it you can teach, because we have evidence from research and practice that says this is what effective leadership looks like. But some of it is just, you gotta have a feel, because this is a human dynamic and it's different every time. Another assumption that we have is that leadership is learnable, which means therefore it can also is teachable. It means we are not born leaders. There is some evidence that there are certain natural tendencies that some of us have that might make leadership easier than other people based on some personality aspects that you are developing, but it's all learnable. It's behavioral, which means you can teach leadership. So that's a really important piece that I want you to keep in mind, that leadership is learnable. It is both intrapersonal, meaning it's all about you as an individual, but it's also interpersonal. It's about me in relationship to you. Yes. So there's a social dynamic and there's a psychological dynamic. Another assumption that we hold about leadership, and this is fundamental to our understanding of emotionally intelligent leadership, is it's not about a position. It's not about a title. It's not about a role. Leadership is available to all of us. And that leadership is more than just a leader. I've done this kind of work for about 25-ish years. And one of the things I love to do is to ask people to jot down all the words that come to mind when I say the word leadership. And more often than not, I'd say 90% of the time, people attribute their thinking about leadership to a leader. And I want to break through that myth. Leadership is more than just the leader. Leadership is about the interpersonal dynamic. How do I engage with others? Some people call those others followers. And it's about the context, the setting, the situation you find yourself in. And this is really important to us as we talk about this time period of things aren't quite normal. They're not quite predictable. So those are some assumptions I wanted to share with you, and I want to shift now to perceptions. Those are also in our backpack as we go on this journey into turbulent times. So what do I mean by perceptions? Tell me what you see. Oh, wait, a rabbit or a duck? How many of you see a rabbit? Show of hands.
See the rabbit?
Okay. How many of you see a duck?
I see both.
How many of you see both?
I do.
Okay, so if you don't see both, this is the rabbit's ears, and the rabbit is looking that way. That's the nose and the eye. Or it's a duck, that's the beak, and that's the eye, and the duck is looking over here. Now, does everyone see the rabbit and the duck? Are we good? Okay, so what do we see here? Two faces? How many of you see two faces? Okay, but I heard something else. A vase. How many of you see a vase? So what's right? Who's right? So we see multiple things. It's like that picture of the river where some saw peace and serenity and others saw excitement. Why am I asking you about perception if we're talking about leadership? What's the connection between perceptions and seeing two different realities in one picture? What's that have to do with leadership? It's about assessment. Very important. And assessment done by whom?
By the folks who have leadership authority and the folks who are leader followers.
Excellent. So who's doing the assessing? It's both the person who is in the leader role or is doing the leadership and the people who are involved in that leader-follower relationship. And are all the perceptions the same? No. We can look at the same thing and see it many different ways. So the lens that we bring to any leadership situation or any leadership dynamic is informed by our personalities, on our experiences, and it influences us in lots of different ways. So we have to remember that perceptions are reality, and you may sit next to the person and know them super well, but what they see is very different than what you see. So keep in mind that perceptions impact not only what we see outside and around us, but also ourselves. Remember that intrapersonal part? That's the inner work of leadership that in emotional intelligence is especially critical. So now what do you see again? I want to point out what someone said, there are rapids. And you saw this right at the beginning. Someone saw this. Now the first time I saw this picture, all I saw was actually the hikers. And I was like, oh, what an amazing scene to peacefully be walking along this river. And then if you look a little more carefully, you see the rapids. So what are those rapids? In today's world, we can talk about those rapids using the acronym Vuca. Has anyone heard of Vuca before? Okay, so Vuca stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So when I'm talking about turbulent times, where we find ourselves today, we are living in a Vuca world. And what's really interesting is that this term was coined in the late 1980s in the Army War College to talk about post-Cold War realities in our world. What was true then is true now. So when I talk about volatility, this Vuca world, what volatility means is that we can't predict what's happening. We are in a rapidly changing environment. What we think is true today isn't necessarily true tomorrow. And what we know from the past isn't necessarily going to help us predict the future. What do I mean by uncertain? It has to do with that lack of predictability. We're not clear as to what's coming. We're not clear about what's happening. Things we used to know as true and sure are now not so true and sure. So these are all different ways to understand what do we mean by these turbulent times. So there's a complexity built into the Vuca world. And complexity has to do with the interconnected nature of our lives. So if you think about that picture of us on the river, while we're like in our raft going down the river, the complexity of the river is that we have to be aware that there are currents underneath the water. There are rocks in the water. It's all connected with the winds that are blowing. And in our lives, we have this same kind of interconnectedness. We know that we live in a global reality. What is happening halfway across the world does impact us. And then here closer at home, what's happening across the street has to do with what's happening in here. So we want to think about the fact that issues and problems are intermingled and they're not isolated. And then finally, the A in Vuca stands for ambiguous, meaning that we're lacking clarity. That things we used to know for sure, we now call into doubt. And that we may not have the confidence in where we are, who we are, what we are about. And so really this VUCA world can be incredibly disorienting. It's incredibly stressful. It's exhausting. And it is where we find ourselves. This is the COVID reality, is that we are in a VUCA world. So what does it mean to be in a leadership role? What does it mean to navigate this VUCA world with emotionally intelligent leadership? That's the set of stories I want you to think about as I talk about our experiences at the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, and as I ask you to engage with one another in thinking about what does it mean to lead at whatever level. Remember the assumption, leadership does not require a position or title. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what our leaders at CMSD did and some of the choices that we had to make. Remember, that's one of the things in our backpacks are choices. And how do we navigate in this world? So let me ask you about March 13th, 2020. Can you think back to that time, that day even? Does anyone remember clearly March 13th, 2020? Okay, do me a favor, and for the next 3 minutes, I want you just to turn to your neighbor or a couple people near you. I want you to reflect back to what comes to mind when you see that date, March 13th, 2020. Talk to your neighbor about it. What do you remember seeing, feeling, doing, even vaguely? Okay, if I can have you come back. Thank you for taking a few minutes to go back in time. Curious what that time frame, when you went back, either based on what you said or what you heard, what were some of the emotions being experienced?
Fear.
What? Fear. Disbelief. What else? What did it feel like at that time? Say again? Uncertainty, absolutely. That you in Vuca was really strong. Fear, uncertainty, disbelief. So for me, on March 13th, 2020, I was called into a meeting room by our superintendent CEO. That was his title. That's actually who I worked directly for. And he had the key leaders from the organization. There were about 20 of us in this room, and he said, we're going to go on an extended spring break. Haha. Cool, we get some time off. However, the question was, what did that mean? So I want you to hold on to that question of what did it mean to go on an extended spring break? Because sitting in that room at that time, my role was to be the coach, the leadership coach, to all of those people in the room. And my job was to support them in the decisions that they were making, because it had been my job. It wasn't just my job that day. That was my job at the district for 4 years before. I was building their leadership capacity. And so here we are in a moment of total uncertainty with disbelief and fear, and this notion that, cool, we're going on spring break for 3 weeks. Some people actually were relieved. Anyone feel relief that day? Probably not. Oh, 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. Thank you. So there were some people who were feeling relief. In that moment, when we were called into the room, the thing I was thinking about was, what are the tools that we have to use to make sense of this time? So in other words, what are the assets that we have in our backpack that is going to help us deal with this extended spring break where we didn't know what that meant? And this is where emotionally intelligent leadership comes in, because there is a leadership response to the VUCA world. And that is that you have vision, you have understanding, you demonstrate courage, and you are adaptable. And emotionally intelligent leadership helps you get there. So that's part of what I'm trying to think about at that moment. Now, I didn't have this clarity. What I did know was that we had certain assets that we could draw on that would help us deal with this crisis that we were facing as an organization. Like, how do we do this? How are we going to deal with an extended spring break? So emotionally intelligent leadership to me was that set of assets that we had. And why did we have that? Because emotional intelligence is something that everybody has. This is an asset that we all carry in our backpack. Whether we know it or not, we all have it because we're human. And to me, that is one of the most powerful reasons why emotionally intelligent leadership is, in some ways, the answer to that really difficult question about what makes leadership effective. There are a set of tools that we all have access to as individuals. So why does emotional intelligence matter? Because it is a key differentiator in how we manage stress and how we actually just engage in the world, and it is a driver for success. Now, the thing is while we all have it, it doesn't mean necessarily that we use it. And so part of what we advocate for in saying that emotionally intelligent leadership is a set of assets for you is because we are pulling out in very explicit ways the ways in which emotional intelligence impacts the way we demonstrate leadership. So one of the very clear reasons why emotional intelligence matters in the leadership context is actually not from data that we know this, but it's actually from this beautiful quote from Maya Angelou, which simply gets us thinking about the fact that people remember how you make them feel. Fundamentally, they'll forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, they will not forget how you make them feel. So that's another reason why emotional intelligence is so important in the leadership context, particularly in this Vuca space where people are feeling uncertain and scared. They want to feel a sense of hope. They want to feel a sense of security. Emotional intelligence, from a leadership context, can get you there. So why do we care about the emotions themselves? This is not about feelings. Let me be clear. There's a difference between emotions and feelings. Emotions are actually adaptive responses that lead to behaviors. And this graphic that I have on the screen is a very simple version of what's going on in our brains. We feel immediately, we experience an emotion immediately in the back of our brain at our brainstem, in our most privileged part of the brain. And what's fascinating through neuroscience, we've learned that our emotions impact the way we think, the way we make decisions, and the way we behave. How we think, how we make decisions, and how we behave. Emotions are adaptive responses that lead to behavior. Science shows that, but the reason why leadership is both art and science is just because science shows that doesn't mean that that's what we do. We have to be cognizant of that. And so what we have to be cognizant of is that there's a lot of stuff going on in our brain, and that emotional space is in that very primitive part of the brain. And in order to be smart about our emotions, we have to pull those emotions forward so that they impact, in a conscious way, our thoughts, our decisions, and behaviors. And that's what it means to be emotionally intelligent. Now, in a leadership situation, it's even more powerful because we know that emotions are contagious. And so if a leader is calm in the face of a crisis, that person spreads calm. If a leader is highly anxious, angry, frustrated, that emotion spreads even faster. There are these things in our brains called mirror neurons, where even not consciously, you start experiencing the similar emotion that I'm experiencing if I have a position of authority and I'm demonstrating leadership because of the power that's at play. So in a turbulent time where people are feeling uncertain and not clear, and they're feeling threatened in some way, there's a natural response of fight, flight, or freeze. And what emotional intelligence does is it helps us unfreeze. It helps us not necessarily fight unless we think we need to. It helps us to not run away unless we think we need to. It makes us smarter in how we respond. So the question is, how do we do that? So You can probably imagine the kinds of emotions that we were feeling at the district. And on March 13th, 2020, I'm looking around the room trying to think, how am I going to support my colleagues as they navigate us through this extended spring break that had never happened before. And what I want to share with you is that these three facets of emotionally intelligent leadership are what help individuals navigate through uncertainty. Now, it also helps us in times of ease and comfort, but what I saw in that room were another set of emotions like concern, because the school district is responsible for feeding 37,000 plus children 2 times a day, 5 days a week, and often on the weekends as well. I saw self-doubt. I don't know how to do this. I've never been in this position before. I'm going to have to make a decision. I saw the weight of responsibility like push people to the ground. So all I'm thinking is, okay, so how do I help my colleagues be conscious of themselves, be conscious of others, and be conscious of the context? Because these are the 3 dimensions of emotionally intelligent leadership that we call the facets that help achieve the kinds of outcomes we're seeking in a leadership situation. So in that context, think about individuals who have leadership responsibilities. They have to be conscious of themselves. I'm feeling self-doubt, yet I am responsible for figuring out this problem with the organization. I don't know how we're going to work together when we're all experiencing uncertainty and a lack of clarity, but if we're going to be effective, leadership requires that interpersonal dynamic. Remember, leadership is intrapersonal, about me. It's also about us. It's also about the setting and situation we find ourselves in. So, how do we do that? How do we actually be emotionally intelligent in our leadership? And it is through a set of capacities that I'm going to show you in just a couple minutes. And these 19 capacities are the assets that we carry in our backpack. And when you see this list of capacities, you're going to say, oh, that's interesting. I never thought that that would be something I could use. Or you're going to say, oh yeah, I do that stuff all the time. This is part of why emotionally intelligent leadership makes a difference. It's because it's easily accessible. So essentially imagine these are your oars. These are your paddles that are going to take you through those rapids. And the question is, how effectively do you use these 19 capacities? So hopefully you can see this model pretty simply laid out. And you'll see that there are a set of capacities under self. These are the things we can do, the combination of skills and abilities and self-perceptions and attitudes and beliefs that help us demonstrate consciousness of self. Then you'll see the set of capacities that are all about how do we interact well together? How do I demonstrate that I'm conscious of that leader-follower interaction? And then you'll see 2 capacities under context. Now, you're probably saying, okay, I see them. Do I know what they mean? And the answer is yes. What was that quote by Doris Kearns Goodwin about use plain language? Be simple. What you see is pretty much what you get. There's not a lot of fancy explanation behind any of these capacities, save for maybe 2. So I just want to give you a chance to play with this model a little bit and think about where you were March 13, 2020, what you were feeling, and how any one of these capacities of self can help you navigate that uncertainty, that lack of clarity. So out of curiosity, which of these kind of just resonate with you as, yeah, that would work for me, or that does work for me? Any immediate reactions? Yeah.
Optimism.
Optimism. Why does optimism help when you're in this time of turbulence?
Well, because you have to have a can-do spirit, that we're going to be okay, and we can do this, we can get through this.
Great. Absolutely. We have amazing research that talks about the power of leadership that's positive and the impact on others. versus the power of leadership that's negative and the impact of on others. And you're far more productive when you're positive. And by the way, optimism is a learned set of skills, which a lot of people don't realize. Anyone else have a thought? Which of these individual capacities of self? Yeah.
I really like initiative.
Yeah?
I think that when you're down like that, you have to take in what's happening negatively and like take initiative yourself to turn it positive and like figure out how can I do that.
Beautifully said. So taking initiative, how do you take in the situation you find yourself in and do something? Take that first step. Take the negative and turn it positive. That's how initiative and optimism work together, which is a great example of what emotionally intelligent leadership does for us, is it gives us a set of tools that work together in different combinations. So then we have the consciousness of others set of capacities. Lots of these probably look really familiar to you because when you talk about leadership training, this is often what you spend your time on. How do we work well together? The one I want to point out is demonstrating citizenship, because sometimes people are a little confused about our use of the word citizenship. We're not talking about nationality. We're talking about recognizing you're part of a larger whole. And that there are times when you have to give to the larger whole, perhaps sacrificing something for yourself. So the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So, same kind of question. You can imagine which one of these might help you, and maybe you're saying, well, all of them would help. Or you might be saying, well, I'm not really sure. And that would be a very legitimate response as well, because it isn't always clear. We have to do that assessment. What is needed here? The one thing that I will tell you about this model that confuses people is that we have just two capacities of consciousness and context. People often say, well, does that mean it's easier or less important? No, it's not easier. No, it's not less important. It's actually more important. And when we think about navigating in a Vuca world through turbulent times, these two capacities are especially important. So emotionally intelligent leadership has all of these. They're baked into us. And the question is, what are the choices that we make to demonstrate our leadership? How do we use these capacities in the situations that we find ourselves in? And I want to just tell you a few examples from our experience from March 13th, 2020. March 13th, 2020 to today. So in the volatility of a Vuca world, we met that challenge through vision. And our CEO declared within about 6 weeks of March 13th. So obviously the extended spring break kept going, right? We all were sent home. It was no longer spring break. And what he said was, this is the opportunity for us to confront inequity. Because we are an under-resourced institution. We don't have enough resources. We have never dreamt, for instance, of being able to teach kids any other way than having them in front of us 5 days a week from this time to this time. And what we have to do is figure out new ways to teach. So we partnered with a local television station that volunteered or gave us philanthropically airtime, and we had teachers who taught their lessons on this television station that we knew all the kids in the community could access because they have TVs. That was an innovation that was dealing with the inequities. Because, by the way, we are not a district that has computers. Like some of you maybe went to school and had computers from your district, or depending on where you go to school, you get a laptop. We are not one of those districts. We provided packets, homework packets on a daily and weekly basis at our meal sites, because the very first decision that my boss made was that we would continue meal service not just for every child in our district, but for every child in the city of Cleveland. Because we had to ensure that they were still fed. The other thing that he decided at the very beginning was we will partner in very different ways to make sure that we are delivering learning in spaces and places. So how do we use the public libraries once they open? Well, we couldn't wait for them to open, So how do we use the resources of the library to support our teachers? So we met the volatility with a vision that said, we will deliver learning in new ways. So if you remember the U in Vuca, when we described the uncertainty that we face in a Vuca world, you meet that from a leadership perspective with understanding. And what Eric decided, my boss, was that we would feed all the children, as I just said. And what that meant was we had to figure out, how do we get food to schools? How do we get kids to school? So we actually mobilized buses so that we didn't open all 100 buildings. We opened some of our buildings because we couldn't staff them all, obviously, but we had buses that moved kids and families to the feeding sites where they could pick up their food and pick up their homework packets. And by the way, even if your child didn't go to a CMSD school, if you had a third grader at home, you could pick up one of those packets so that you could continue. I was working one of the sites and a police officer came in and he said, you know, I've got a third grader at home, but my third grader goes to a charter school. Would it be okay if I took one of these home? Yes. So we met this uncertainty with understanding of the challenges that our families were facing, and that we were able to be very creative and innovative in terms of even how do we put the food together. What I didn't know was that there were federal rules around funding school lunch. We had to figure out how to work with the federal rules to make sure we were still funding school lunch, even though kids weren't in the buildings. Amazingly complex. So how do we meet that complexity? Well, we meet it with courage. And Eric said that day, March 13, 2020, I don't care if the feds come after us, we will feed every child in the district and in the community. Let them come after us. And there were people in the room like, are you kidding me? We're going to break the law? And someone actually said, are you kidding me? We're going to break the law? And he said, if that's how they want to see it, yes. Because we will feed the children of Cleveland. And to me, that was one of the strongest demonstrations of emotionally intelligent leadership because of the way that Eric, read this situation, pardon me, and said, fundamentally, we have to not only educate our children, but we have to take care of our families. And this is about more than just CMSD families. This is about our community's families. And if that means that I'm going to get in trouble with law enforcement, so be it. Not like police law enforcement, but the rules of finance. So be it. And that courage then spreads, and there's that confidence that spreads. And so the emotions that come with confidence and courage then inspired that ongoing innovation. So with that courage to address the feeding issue, we also said there are suburban districts where they have, every student has a laptop or a Chromebook or a tablet. This didn't happen March of 2020. This happened more like in May of 2020. And by August, we had purchased and received and distributed 37,000 laptops, tablets, devices, so that every one of our students had what we take for granted, which is connectivity. However, what we learned was they had the device, but they didn't have the connectivity. Because in addition to Cleveland being the second poorest, or sometimes the poorest, we fight with Detroit for the bottom, unenviable position, we are actually among the least connected urban metropolitan areas. So we then had to figure out, well, just because they have the laptop doesn't mean that they're connected. We have to address the digital divide. So we ordered something like 50,000 hotspots because they didn't have the internet connection. So again, courage meeting the complexity and the belief that this was the right thing to do. Take initiative, make it happen. Assess the environment. Here's what we have to do. The final way that we address the complexity, the uncertainty, the volatility, the ambiguity of a VUCA world is to be adaptable. And this is where I saw my colleagues most clearly demonstrating their emotional intelligence in their leadership. Because the ways in which they worked together broke down barriers that had existed for some of them for 20 years. And they learned how to put those aside because of the larger purpose. What I saw was the ways in which relationships were fostered through the work to address these big challenges. And in and amongst all of this, the adaptability required significant self-care. And so one of the hallmarks of emotionally intelligent leadership is this thing called emotional self-awareness and emotional self-control. Those were among the more fragile experiences that people were having when it came to demonstrating those skills, those abilities. And so the ways in which we had to then shift into what are you doing to take care of yourself so that you have the resources to help others and work with others was a key part of how we met the challenge. So here's my question to you. What I'd love you to do is think for a couple minutes about these capacities, these 19 capacities. Imagine them as your oars that are going to help you paddle down this river during the turbulent times. I don't think it's unfair to say we are still in them. I think we still have uncertainty, we still have complexity, there's still ambiguity, and it's still volatile. So hopefully some of my stories have helped bring to life the connection between how does leadership address the Vuca world through vision, through understanding, through courage, and through adaptability. What I'd love you to do is, again, turn to the person next to you, or maybe turn to someone else, and say, okay, so which of these capacities are going to help you as you continue to navigate the turbulent times you're finding yourselves in? Because we all are in them right now. So as you think about how might you demonstrate your own emotionally intelligent leadership, have that quick conversation. Take about 2 or 3 minutes. Again, just sharing with your person sitting next to you, which of these capacities do you think you draw on to help yourself, to help you navigate and to help you demonstrate leadership? Go ahead and have that short conversation. Okay, if I can have you wind down and come back to one. Fabulous. Well, I hope you were able to have just a quick touch of a conversation and think about how might this set of capacities help you. What I would love to do is just open it up and say, what questions do you have? Do you have anything that you'd like to share as you've reflected on this, thought about what emotionally intelligent leadership can look like for you? Particularly happy to just open the floor up for questions, comments, observations. Yes?
So how do you practice this? How do you get better at it?
How do you get better at it is the question. How do you practice it? So thank you for that. There are lots of different ways that I think you can go about it. The recommendation that I would give you is, one, take some time to assess yourself. Now, we actually have an assessment. You can actually order it. It's, I think, still $5. We priced it super, super low because we wanted lots of people to have access to it. So you can formally do an assessment. But you can informally do an assessment and say, essentially, what do I do really well that's on this list? What do I struggle with? And I would recommend that you come up with your top 3 of both. What do you do really well? What do you struggle with? And then you ask yourself, if I could improve in one of these areas, and which one would make the biggest difference in my day-to-day? Just one. Now, some people are inclined to take what they're good at and get great at it. So you can look at your top 3 and say, oh, I want to get excellent at this one. Or some people like to say, look, I don't like the deficiencies, the limitations. So you look at the one that you're struggling with and say, if I could make this less of a struggle, that would make the biggest difference in my life. It doesn't matter how you choose, as long as you have energy around that choice. But just pick one. And then, once you've picked the one, then I would say, spend some time thinking about, so where does this show up for me? So for instance, if I say flexibility is the one that I want to work on, because I realize I'm not as flexible as I could or perhaps should be. There's again an assessment process. So I like that that word came out early in this evening's conversation, because without assessment, you aren't really knowing what you're doing. So once you pick the one that you want, then use another assessment process of, well, so when am I and when aren't I? And why am I not? And when I am, what does that look like? And again, it's another, do you take what you're good at and build on it, or do you take your limitations and address those limitations? And each of us is wired differently. Some of us get really dragged down addressing the limitations. So those are the people who I say, go with your strengths and make them even better. But I think once you assess, okay, when am I good, when am I not good, the process, I would argue, is a kind of a continuous cycle of reflection, experimentation. So you got it's actually reflection, planning, experimentation, reflection. So reflect on what you're good at. I'll get more specific. I'm good at being flexible when I know what my choices are. So then I'm going to plan for when I know I'm going to need to be flexible, how do I get my choices more clear? Then I'm going to practice that flexibility, and I'm going to reflect on how well it went. And that cycle of reflection, planning, experimentation is how you start to build a new habit. Does that help?
Yes.
So, assessment, kind of in two phases, and start with one. I can't emphasize that enough. So this model, so lots of you have looked at leadership, read about leadership. There are all different kinds of leadership models. This is not what is called a mastery model. This is not saying you have to be excellent at all 19. What this is really is a toolbox. And it's a set of tools that you can use and choose from. And the goal is to continually get better in the ways that you can best get better. So there's no one that's more important than the other. There's no one right combination of these 19. But what we do have is evidence that all 19 make a difference and that they interact with each other, which can make it really hard. So it's a great question of how do you practice it. Other questions? Yes?
So I'm curious about your boss here.
Yeah.
And the political leadership in Cleveland. Is there a school board, for example? Because part of assessing the environment means either knowing how the school board is going to react to the decisions that you make.
Correct.
Either he makes, or being kind of leading up.
Yes.
Right, to your
Yes.
bosses. And so how does your boss work that?
So excellent question. So in case you didn't hear on this side of the room, the question's about how my boss works the political realities of being the CEO, superintendent. Is there a board? How does he lead up and work in that situation? Because that is about assessing the environment. Excellent question, and a really true demonstration of a unique organizational structure. So without getting too detailed, the answer is yes, he has a board. The school board is appointed by the mayor, who is also his boss. So he has a dual reporting structure. It's by state law. It's a crazy situation. But he is evaluated by the board, and he serves the board. They're his bosses, but the mayor can say you're either in or out. So he has two sets of bosses, an individual, the mayor, and a board of either 7 or 8. So his leading up is constant. It's about communication. It's about transparency, and frankly, it's about courage. And one of the things that Eric does, his name's Eric Gordon, one of the things that Eric does very well is he keeps his bosses in the loop. So he meets with them, both the mayor and the board, every week. And the board meets every other week. It's a very active school board. But they are mayorally appointed, which means they're not susceptible to the whims of the electorate, but they are susceptible to who the mayor is. And we have a new mayor for the first time in 12 years. So it's a very interesting time. When March 13, 2020 hit, and what's happened since then, there has been a very constant exchange of information. And thankfully, the school board is very supportive of his leadership, and he is very supportive of their leadership. So it's a very healthy relationship, but it is one that is cultivated very deliberately, and there's a lot of leading up. So great question. And very applicable to all of us, because we all will be in a position where we have a boss. Even the president has a boss. So, that's right, she's sitting right there. So, great question. Yes?
So I'm going to first speak my question because I want make some explanation. So my question is, how can we trust people more briefly and give them energy and brave to encourage them to make decisions? Because I am so clearly of myself. I have some strong ideas about everything, and I'm so clear myself. But I want to respect all people, and I want to give them more freedom to make their self decisions. One example happened I just checked the photos on March 12, 2020. I just encouraged at that time one classmate asked me, he's a Chinese student, and he asked me, okay, so Francis, how do you think about this COVID-19 situation? And should we go back to our home as soon as possible? And I tell him my decision clear, and I have to tell him, you have to make your self-decision. It's not propaganda you. I'm not forced you to go back home, so you have to make your self-decision. And then, but unfortunately, he didn't go back to China at that time, and he get COVID. I'm so sad at that time. But I still think about I can't force people to do something.
Right.
I have to encourage them, but I can't. So making the balance between I trust people, they can make their decision, but I untrust people, they can just separate my decision and their
theirs.
ways. I don't want to impact people. So how
Great.
can I figure out this balance?
Yes, thank you. That is such a great question and a huge challenge. So again, in case you didn't hear in the back part of the room, the question in a lot of respects is, how do you work with people? How do you get them to trust themselves? And you have a clear understanding of yourself and your own decisions. You don't want to make someone else make a decision. But how do you help them and support them? So I want to point to a couple of these capacities, because your question is a really excellent one that hits into that consciousness of others category. So you're saying you're very clear about yourself, you have confidence in your own decision, you don't want to make someone else think they have to make the same decision as you. So one thing you said that I think is really important is, how do you put yourself in the shoes of another person? That's displaying empathy. And so in this situation, you said he was trying to decide, should he go back to China, just like you were trying to decide. You knew your decision was not to.
I go back.
You went back, he chose not to.
He chose not.
Right. So the question is, how do you help someone make a decision where you have a strong opinion? And your own decision. Part of it is displaying empathy, because that gives us some humility and recognize that I'm different than everyone everyone else? And how do I respect that person and trust that person? Part of it is also in terms of that next one, which is inspiring others. So how do you inspire others? Sometimes it's by what you do, and you're a role model. Sometimes it's by helping them tap into their own values and their own ideas, and how do you help them access those? And part of what you also talked about is on the basis of a relationship, because you said trust, and trust is a very powerful commodity, really, in relationships. So that third, where is it, 6 down, where it says developing relationships, part of what you're talking about is what's the nature of the relationship that you have with someone, and how do you build it to be trusting. A huge factor in whether you trust or someone trusts you is in listening, and do they see you as trustworthy? So those are some ideas that I would offer you.
So I trust all people when I first met them, or sometimes across, and I have communication with them. I always trust people, but I don't want to be, this can be like something, oh, I trust you, but you don't trust me. You well, so I just like, I trust you, but you don't have to trust me. Absolutely. So
Right,
it's
right.
it is your freedom.
Yes.
It's your thinking about me or your decisions. But I'm still confused by when people feel confused and they find me and ask me. At that time, I feel so stressful, but not because they ask me, but because they kind of like want to find answers from me, and I don't know. I should express myself to them, or I should give them free to see.
Well, it's a hard situation. I mean, and I think that that's part of what I would say is true about leadership in general, is that it's hard. And by the way, leadership happens in all sorts of informal environments, like you're describing, amongst friends. So thank you for that question, and I think we're out of time, so I'm going to turn it back to Lauren.
I just want you to join me in thanking Marcy Shankman. For helping us move from that space from individual action, and then also thinking about the collective and how we work with one another. I know Marcy's willing to stick around for a few minutes. If you have particular questions or observations, you'd like to come front and talk with her. So thank you for being here this evening, and thank you again, Marcy.